I started just incorporating newspaper clippings into still lives, which had been done before. Picasso and the Cubists and various other people had done that. And then, basically, the newspaper clippings just took over. I started juxtaposing two newspaper clippings. Instead of like a newspaper clipping with another object, it became just newspaper clippings. And I'd juxtapose image with text and different stories that were of interest to me, mainly still meditations on death, mortality, bringing in certain things about genetics, cloning. So it's still sort of birth and death, quite traditional subject, but in a contemporary context with contemporary stories from newspapers and images. And during that time, one of the stories that I was following was the US election at the time between George Bush and Al Gore, and the hanging chads, and how they kept recounting in Florida. And it was sometime after that, and they declared Bush the winner. But I had this clipping of Gore really did win Florida. Eventually they'd recounted it, and of course by then Bush was already president. But it was this nice little story, Bush really did win. Gore really did win Florida. It's a picture of a scowling Al Gore on one side and a triumphantly waving George Bush with his cowboy hat on the other side. And I juxtaposed that image with an image of an Arab with a gun, which I'd found on Brick Lane. I'd just been walking down Brick Lane one day, and there was this bit of Arabic newspaper fluttering around on the pavement. And that was one of the things I used to do, was to collect newspaper clippings. I'd just find them places, as well as buying all the newspapers. I used to just find them in places, and that was quite a nice way of, you know, coming across images anyway. So I found this random Arab with a gun, and I used that clipping next to the George Bush Al Gore clipping. So it became a diptych. That diptych was shown in my MA. So my MA, my graduation day, was September the 11th, 2001. And the painting of Al Gore, George Bush, and Arab with gun, the diptych, was in the show on that day. Now that day I wasn't allowed into college because they were marking the show, whatever the external examiners were in. So I turned the TV on. First thing I saw was the second airplane flying into the Twin Towers. And that was the day, 9/11. And all hell broke out. And there was a few American students actually on the course, and their parents were flying in from America that day. And you can imagine it was kind of pandemonium. Anyhow, the next day, that image of the Arab with a gun was in all the papers and on the TV, and it was actually Osama bin Laden doing his training video with his rifle, or whatever it was, his AK-47. So it was kind of weird that I'd put that in my show. It was hung on the wall, and in fact, French collector Fred Leris bought that painting. Neither of us knew the random Arab with a gun was, in fact, Osama bin Laden. So it was a kind of weird coincidence, slightly chilling that that happened. Subsequent to that, I collected all the newspapers for about a week. So following directly from 9/11, I just bought all the newspapers every day for a week. I didn't really look at them, I just collected them. About a week later, I just started going through them and looking at all the images. I mean, incredible images. And I'm sure people remember some of the images. And the result of that was that I did a show, my first solo show after my MA, which was November that year, so just 2 months later. I had a show, and I called it Into Manhattan's Memory, from one particular newspaper clipping of Ground Zero. And so I did about, in that 6-week period, I painted about 20 paintings just from those images of 9/11, and that was my first solo show, Into Manhattan's Memory. And so on, and I just kept going with it from then. It really sort of catapulted me and my work into the newspaper clippings, current, very, you know, strong contemporary story. A lot of people said at the time, it's just going to change everything. And that was where the war on terror started. And so I kept going with that. I kept painting images. From there it went into the Iraq War. Same time I was following other stories like cloning and art world stories and so forth, but those became my main subjects. Within all of that, around about 2003, while I was following the Iraq War story, I started painting obituaries. I started painting the obituaries mainly from The Independent. A guy called James Ferguson was the editor then. He'd started using rather odd images, I thought, for obituaries, quite comical images, even, you know, derogatory images, or, anyway, I thought they were funny. And I just wrote to the Independent, said, who's in charge of these crazy images you're using for the obituaries? And James Ferguson wrote back to me and said, it's me, I'm the editor. So I had this little dialogue with him, and he was rather pleased that I was using his images for my paintings. And from that day to this, I've had this kind of ongoing working relationship, if you like, with the Independent. Actually, he retired, and when he did retire, the people that were taking over came to my studio and bought one of those paintings to give him as his retirement present, which was a rather nice thing that happened. So within all of the other work, the obituaries kind of took over a little bit, and I started doing a lot of those obituaries, mainly working with the Independent and the Guardian. And the fact that they'd started using more unusual images and more interesting images, not just mugshots of people that happened to have died, and that's what interested me. And in a way, it summed up a lot of my work and what it was about. It was still within the context of still life. I was painting objects, and those objects just happened to be two-dimensional objects stuck on a wall. In fact, the Dutch had been doing that in the 17th century, incorporating things like notes and things and clippings on walls, and it's not that unusual. It's just that it was very much a contemporary manifestation of that. So there it is. That's been my work.